Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a, a esta presentación que hacemos por parte del Seminario Universitario de Historia, Filosofía y Estudios de las Ciencias y la Medicina, esta vez dedicado a la celebración de la publicación del origen de las especies de Charles Darwin, que fue precisamente el 24 de noviembre de 1859. En esta ocasión les queremos presentar una serie de conferencias que empiezan hoy y terminan justamente el día viernes, y en el que tendremos 4 especialistas en temas de historia de la ciencia y de historia sobre Darwin. Tengo el agrado de presentar el día de hoy a nuestro ya amigo y colega, el doctor Kapil Raj. El doctor Raj estudió matemáticas en la India y posteriormente estudió filosofía e historia de las ciencias para abordar la cuestión de la producción y transmisión de ideas científicas entre diferentes culturas. Él ha cuestionado fuertemente el difusionismo y su contraparte agonística con el objetivo de favorecer el choque de civilizaciones. También se enfoca en la historia del papel de las circulaciones e interacciones culturales en la formación y transformación del conocimiento y de la ciencia. Basado en un análisis histórico detallado de la construcción del conocimiento naturalista, geográfico, lingüístico y social, su investigación abre una perspectiva global, atenta a la emergencia policéntrica del conocimiento y su apropiación diferenciada según el lugar, ampliando los debates actuales en torno a la historia colonial, postcolonial y mundial, así como aquellos historiográficos sobre el eurocentrismo y el encierro nacional y culturalista de las ciencias sociales. Él ha propuesto en diferentes obras tomar la circulación misma como objeto de estudio histórico y así participar en la renovación de las historias nacionales. Él ha publicado, tiene una obra publicada muy extensa. Solo les quiero recomendar, este libro es muy famoso, Relocating Modern Science, y otro más reciente que publicó The Broker World, Go-Betweens and Global Intelligence, que publicó en coautoría con Simon Schaffer, Lisa Roberts y James Del Burgo. Sin más, le cedo la palabra al doctor Kapil. Dear Kapil, dear Professor Raj, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that wonderful and very generous introduction. So without further ado, let me share my screen. So I just go to share screen, I suppose.
Yes.
And no.
We can see it now.
You can see it?
Yes.
Okay. But before anything, I have to
To click the...
No. Oh, I'm sorry, because there's a problem. I'm not being able to get presenter view.
What if you click in your bottom right?
Yeah. Can you see the screen?
The screen, yes.
My screen, complete.
Yes, it says scientific revolution.
Yeah, just a minute, because I want my notes. Marco, can you help?
Yes, you need to stop sharing first.
Okay. So stop sharing. Where do I go for stop sharing? Okay. Yeah, stop share.
Yes.
Share screen, desktop 1.
Just a sec. Now?
Now,
no.
Share screen, desktop 1.
Just a minute. I've lost you all now. Okay. Share screen. And then?
Desktop 1.
Desktop 1. Yeah, okay. Right.
Okay. And that.
Yes, there.
No.
Yes.
Yeah, but but I can't see. I can only see my own screen. I can't see my
your notes?
No.
Before sharing your presentation, you need to go on the bottom of the PowerPoint and then on view.
Okay.
Or on the presentation with slides button.
Okay, I'm on my screen now.
Yes.
I'm on my my PowerPoint. Now what do I do?
Go to the button, presentation with slides.
Go to the bottom. Yeah.
And click on the moderator view.
Moderator view.
On the upper side of your window.
Gosh, I'm lost here. So at the bottom of my thing, I have slides, I have accessibility, I have notes. I have comments, I have.
No, on the upper side.
Yeah, on the upper side. Yeah, on the upper side, what do I do?
Go to the presentation with slides.
No, I'm panicking now. The upper part.
Yes. Next to the help button.
Yeah.
It says
slideshow.
Yeah. And then moderator view.
It says presenter view.
Yes. Presenter
yeah,
view.
But when I do presenter view, it's the full screen.
Just click on the presenter view.
Yeah.
And then share your screen, desktop 1. And you should be able to see your notes.
No, the moment I do presenter view, the whole my whole screen becomes the slideshow.
Oh, no. Otherwise, I think you're kind of going to be able to see your notes.
Oh, gosh. Oh, hell. Okay. I'll have to. Oh, this is really bad news. Because you had a way of doing it last time, Marco.
Or you can send it to me, and then I can present.
Yeah, but it's a huge file. Okay, just a sec. Oh, gosh. So share screen. Okay, just 1 second. I'm really sorry about this. Okay, let's see now. Share screen does not want to start. Okay.
You need to share desktop 1, otherwise we only can see your PowerPoint.
Desktop 1. No, I don't know. I mean, just a minute. Let me stop share. Desktop. Okay. So where is desktop 1?
Just after share screen, desktop 1.
Ah, okay. Right. And then
Full screen.
no, it's the same problem. Just a sec. Let me do it again. So share screen, desktop 1. Presenter view. No, it's the same problem.
Yes, because you only have 1 monitor.
No, but normally, I mean, I was using the same monitor. Ah, okay. Okay, I've got it. So, sorry about this, folks. And
no, not at all. When you're ready.
okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk to you about rethinking the concept of the scientific revolution. Now, 3 years ago, when I first came to Mexico, I gave a series of 3 talks, and this was the 3rd of the talks. And it was based on an article which I just published shortly before that called Thinking Without the Scientific Revolution, Global Interactions and the Construction of Knowledge. And this article was published in the Journal of Early Modern History in 2017. And my talk was based on that. Now, I'm not going to give exactly the same talk, but I will first and foremost give a summary of what I talked about last time. And then I go on. In fact, since this is part of a series about the origin of species, to talk a little bit about the 19th century and Darwin himself. So in the first bit, I'm going to first summarize the paper that I gave last time. And so amongst the many narrative strategies in the recent global turn in the history of science, one commonly finds attempts to complement the single European story by multiplying histories of knowledge making in as many different regional and cultural contexts as possible. So so we have a Western story, but then we also have an Indian story, we have a Chinese story, a Japanese story, a Mexican story, a Brazilian story, and so on and so forth. And this follows the old area studies model. Other strategies include attempts to generalize the Needham question of why the scientific revolution occurred only in early modern Europe to the exclusion of other parts of the world, or instead to challenge the diffusionist vision of the spread of modern science from Europe by attempting to show that non-European scientific traditions already had an understanding of recent European discoveries. These latter strategies seek simply to pluralize the scientific revolution without actually unpacking the latter concept itself. Now, one example of this, which must be familiar to you all, is Jorge Cañizares Esguerra and his many writings on the subject. So, how to write the history of the New World, histories, epistemologies, and identities in the 18th century Atlantic world, or Nature, Empire, and Nation, explorations on the history of science in the Iberian world. And he seeks over here to reclaim the idea of the concept of the scientific revolution for the Iberian world, which he feels, and quite justly so, unjustly left out of the narrative. But again, this is calling into question diffusionism, but without calling into question the categories themselves. Now, what I had wanted to do, of course, was to look at this. So amongst the many narrative strategies of, so one of the things that then happens is that so this, these strategies seek simply to pluralize the scientific revolution. And what I was trying to do in this was to show that, in fact, the scientific revolution was an invention of the post-Second World War world, and in this of the Cold War period. And it was a way, in fact, of distinguishing Western civilization from the rest. And when it was invented as a concept, and when it became the very basis of the history of the history of science, and the way in which it was taught, the very foundation stone on which the history of modern science was based, it was not just a concept and a marker, a chronological marker, but more than that, it was also a civilizational marker. And this is something that did not escape any of the writers of the period. So let me give you some examples of the way in which the scientific revolution was presented from the very origin of the term in the very first writings of historians of science. So, here is Herbert Butterfield, for instance, one of the first people who writes about the scientific revolution in English. And this is what he says in the origins of modern science. He says the scientific revolution outshines everything since the rise of Christianity and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes, mere internal displacements within the system of medieval Christendom. The scientific revolution we must regard, therefore, as a creative product of the West, depending on a complicated set of conditions which existed only in Western Europe. And when we speak of Western civilization being carried to an Oriental country like Japan in recent generations, we do not mean Greco-Roman philosophy and humanist ideals, We do not mean the Christianizing of Japan. We mean the science, the modes of thought, and all that apparatus of civilization which were beginning to change the face of the West in the latter half of the 17th century. I mean, now, Rupert Hall, European civilization at the beginning of the 16th century was isolated. But during the next centuries, the trend of the Middle Ages was to be reversed. Europeans were to teach the East far more than they learned from it. And these are not the only two people who are writing this. This is more or less a commonly shared concept. Richard Westphal, for instance, in 1986 in the HSS newsletter, the scientific revolution was the most important event in Western history, and a historical discipline that ignores it must have taken an unhappy step in the direction of antiquarianism. And even Thomas Kuhn has this to say: every civilization which we have records, has possessed a technology, an art, a religion, a political system, laws, and so on. In many cases, those facets of civilization have been as developed as our own. But only the civilizations that descend from Hellenic Greece have possessed more than the most rudimentary science. The bulk of scientific knowledge is the product of Europe in the last 4 centuries. No other place and time has supported the very special communities from which scientific productivity comes. So, I mean, this is reclaiming and claiming science just for the West. But again, and here we go on, I mean, Charles Gillespie goes even further. He says the hard trial will begin when the instruments of power created by the West come fully into the hands of men not of the West. So here is forms of anguish, of anxiety about science. So these people who are formed in cultures and religions which leave them quite devoid of the Western sense of some ultimate responsibility to man in history. That secular legacy of Christianity still restrains our world in some slight measure, however self-righteous it may have become on the one side and however vestigial on the other. Men of other traditions can and do appropriate our science and technology, but not our history and values. And what will the day hold when China wields the bomb and Egypt? Will Aurora light a rosy-fingered dawn out of the east, or will Nemesis? And this is The Edge of Objectivity, a classic text, one of the founding texts of the history of science. George Basala, in a way, goes further, but at the same time, he tries to assuage this anxiety by talking about his 3-stage model of diffusion. So for him, diffusion is not just the diffusion of science, because in the 3-stage model, ultimately, when non-Western cultures and civilizations receive science, they receive the culture of the West at the same time. So in a way, what he's trying to do is sell the idea of diffusion as a way of acculturating the rest of the world to Western value, into Western values. And so in a way, he's trying to calm this anxiety of Gillespie and others, what happens when the non-West gets the bomb, or gets Western science at least. So don't worry, if they get it, they'll also get Western values. And we know what Western values are about today. So, I mean, anyway, but this was 60 years ago, so people couldn't quite have followed this. However, so what I did want to show over here was that in this whole tradition, the scientific revolution and what follows is something which distinguishes the West from the rest. And it then becomes very difficult for others to actually lay claim to this concept, because, and if this is the marker, if this is the chronological marker, how can we do, how can we actually try and make a global history, or conceive of a global history with these markers? Now, this is a global problem, in history, about periodizations, chronological markers, and so on, and what they do. But I did want to actually point out that this is not just a question of this early history of science. This idea, in spite of the fact that a lot was thrown out of these early decades of the history of science after the 1970s and the refounding of the history of science in the form of science studies and the social studies of science and the new history. But even there, this very idea is still shared. And here is a quote from Steve Chapin, for instance, where he says, "With our modern insistence that science is universal, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that modern science," and this coming from Steve Chapin, experimental, mathematical, hypothetical, deductive science, was historically a product of Western Europe and not of any other region. Putting aside the chauvinistic and almost certainly false assumption that Western science was preferentially endowed with scientific genius, Western Europe was preferentially endowed with scientific geniuses, we are forced to examine the social, cultural, institutional, and economic context of Europe between 1300 and 1600, which might have encouraged the rise of modern science. So this, of course, is a more politically correct rendition, but it still maintains that Western science is peculiarly and uniquely Western European. And this is from a presentation of a course in the social history of science, which was proposed first at the University of Edinburgh, and Steve Chapin actually presented the whole course in the form of an article in Social Studies of Science in 1980. And this is the chapter or the lecture on the period before the scientific revolution. So, and the scientific revolution is what actually changes things completely and makes science a Western European enterprise. So it is with this in mind that I wanted to go back to to bring into question the very idea of the scientific revolution and to see how one could get about thinking without this notion in a different way, and yet saving the new histories of science, but also the fact that there is something like modern science. And so I sought to actually call into question this notion of the scientific revolution as a chronological marker as to what happens when we try and do away with it, and how can we do away with it while not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So just given the fact that it's so ideologically and politically charged, so we have to think about this if we want to do a global history of science. And it was for that reason that, of course, I wasn't the first person to actually call into question the utility of the history of science. This was done. This had already been done before, especially in an article which was a milestone in this, which was called "Decentering the Big Picture" by Andy Cunningham and Perry Williams. The origins of modern science, that is Butterfield's book, and the modern origins of science, which was published in 1993. And this article actually, laid out all the problems with the concept of the scientific revolution. For one thing, was there science as we know it today in the 17th and 18th centuries? What was called science, what we call science, was not called science then, for one thing, and what people were then practicing was more like natural philosophy or experimental philosophy, and was not recognizably the same thing as what we call science. That's one of their critiques. Now, so taking up on that, I'll come back to that. So when we look at the global turn, I would first and foremost like to propose another way of, another marker, which we might all share and which still would save the essentials of the changes taking place in the 17th, 18th, and 18th centuries. And for this, I was inspired by the writings of a colleague and friend, Sanjay Subramaniam, in his first article, which he called Connected Histories, Notes Towards Reconfiguration of Early Modern Eurasia. And in this, Subramaniam, he says, well, as with the Renaissance, and in contrast to the Reformation, the early modern aims to focus on social, cultural, and intellectual issues. Although coined by European historians in the 1970s, the notion has been appropriated by historians of other regions. And Subramaniam, for instance, he persuasively argued for a large definition encompassing not only Eurasia and Africa, but also pre- and post-Columbian America. And for this, he defines this period, the early modern, as the emergence of, what's going on here? Yeah, of the emergence of a new sense of the limits of the inhabited world, entailing momentous changes in conceptions of space and cartography, and the emergence of new empirical ethnographies, long-term structural conflicts between settled urban and agricultural communities, a new consciousness of the world, and in fact of a deep integration of commercial and cultural exchange between peoples. Now, if one looks at this, this concept can then be used in order to investigate the ways in which we can actually conceive or get a framework in order to be able to look at how knowledge then was not only circulating, but was also being made through intercultural encounter, pretty much like markets, like a lot of other economic, cultural, social characteristics and dimensions of human societies during the 17th and 18th centuries. And knowledge over here is no exception to this fact, to this. So that was the general idea of my presentation that I made in 2019. But now I'd like to come back in the remaining time to the 19th century, because the scientific revolution in this context, in the way in which I presented it, had to do with the 17th and 18th centuries. And here we're actually talking about the 19th century when we're talking about the origin of species and Darwin. And if we are going to actually talk about this period, then I'd like to come back to the idea of the scientific revolution and suggest that, in fact, although we could do away with the scientific revolution, the way in which it was conceived in the history of science, in classical, and even, well, it carries on in the history of science, this idea, because one can't, or historians of science find it impossible to think without this concept, even if they don't like it. But I'd suggested that we throw it out and substitute the idea of the early modern instead of that, in order to be able to actually look at broader circulations and broader phenomena, to take the scientific revolution away, or modern science away from Western Europe, and look at it as a more global phenomenon, or at least to be able to investigate it in more global terms. But as I said, I would now like to come back and say, and ask the question, does this mean that the scientific revolution is a useless concept? And I would like to suggest that in the context of our series of 3 or 4 talks that we're having this week, that we could, in fact, apply the concept of the scientific revolution to the 19th century. Why? For one thing, it is in the 19th century that the very idea of science as we know it gets defined. The word scientist is a word also that emerges during this period, and the institutions of science as we know them, and the disciplinarization of science actually occurs in the 19th century. More than just that, it's also the period during which science becomes an all-encompassing phenomenon, which is the filter through which we look at the world today, and which is the very origin, which forms the very origin of the inquiries into the history of the subject, into the philosophy of the subject, which get undertaken in the 20th century. It's just because of the rise of this phenomenon in the 19th century and the way in which it encompasses almost every dimension of human activity, and including aesthetics, and what's right, what's wrong. In fact, just about everything, that science becomes so important. And Darwin is also a symbol of that. Another reason is that the scientific revolution, the classic scientific revolution, focused much more on the mathematical and experimental sciences in the laboratory. Whereas this scientific revolution, or what I would then suggest we call the scientific revolution, which covers the whole world in a way and affects everyone at the same time, is not so mathematically based. It is pretty much like what Darwin is doing, has to do with humanity, with life, and also with negotiations with others, finding out what's happening everywhere else in the world. And Darwin over here is also an example, an exemplar of a person who's actually making science outside of the laboratory in the open air, as a friend and colleague, Michel Calon, has suggested we use the term instead of laboratory sciences, to talk about the open air sciences. And here's someone who is actually doing that. Now, although we look at Darwin as Darwin as a genius, as someone who accumulates all this information and knowledge and converts it into a model, a theoretical model, much of his work is actually also based on the work of others. And being a historian who has looked more at the interaction between the West, between Europe and South Asia, I would like to just talk a little bit about Darwin and his relationship with South Asia. Now, we all know that the Beagle never landed in anywhere in South Asia, which means the Indian Peninsula. But in fact, Darwin, the only time he actually had a brush with people from of Indian origin was when the Beagle landed and spent a short while anchored off Mauritius, and that's where he encountered his first Indians. And of course, he more or less fell in love with them, and the contrast of their skins with their white hair. He found them noble people, but above all, but he didn't get anything from India, partly because the Beagle was the voyage of the Beagle had been designed in such a way as to avoid India, because there was a lot of information which came from India without actually, so Darwin needn't have gone there, because it was part of the British Empire, and there were lots and lots and lots of people and data in the natural history collections, but also in the political and other collections in Britain itself. So they could economize on that part. But one of the people who was a source of a lot of information for Darwin was a man called Edward Blyth. Now, I don't know how many of you know about Blyth, but Blyth was born in Britain in 1810, and he died in Britain, in London, in 1873. But between these two dates, he was born in a very humble family and always found it very difficult to study, but finally he did. And he was obsessed with animals, and especially birds, but wildlife in general, and ultimately found himself a job in Calcutta as the curator of the Museum of the Royal Asiatic Society in that city. And as such, he collected a lot of information about wildlife in India. And he became one of Darwin's correspondents from that part of the world, giving him a lot of information about cattle, about the wild asses of Asia, and also about crossbreeding geese, and a lot of the information that Darwin had on pigeons. So the point then is, but here, okay, one can say that this information came to Darwin from another Englishman, Edward Blyth. But Edward Blyth never moved out of Calcutta. He was very poorly paid and spent his time in Calcutta actually as an information broker, as someone who gathered information from all kinds of sources, and most of his sources were indigenous, either directly through indigenous sources or else indirectly. For instance, on the asses of Asia, a lot of his information came from European travelers who themselves got this information, and their knowledge also of different breeds, of different species, of ways of breeding and so on, from their local interlocutors. I wouldn't call them informants, because that means that there's something like information, and then that information becomes knowledge, and that's not the way in which things work. These people were interlocutors who had not just information that they gave to raw information, but actual knowledge of how one managed, and on what basis, on what epistemological basis this knowledge was actually founded. And so that's how Blythe actually got his knowledge. And it's this that was very much part of Darwin's basis, both in The Origin of Species and especially in The Descent of Man. In The Origin of Species, he quotes him only 3 times, but in The Descent of Man, it's 40 times that his information comes from Blythe. But more than that, more generally, so this is, this is also based where, on the one hand, I vilified Steve a little while ago, but on the other hand, this is also inspired by the idea of the invisible technician, to see what lies behind the great man's story, and how these invisible technicians are actually working and also making this knowledge. And another work which has just come out a few months ago, which is called Encountering Colonial Science in the Visual Archive by David Lowther. And in this, Lowther points out and brings to the fore a lot of information, knowledge that's circulating in and being made in the colonial context in South Asia, and especially in South India, and how this knowledge then becomes part of what circulates and becomes metropolitan knowledge in the course of the 19th century. And in closing, I would also like to show you some illustrations of botanical illustrations done by Indian artists who were not shown any exemplars, but who, through communication with medics in India, especially Scottish medics, have made these drawings and then finally also printed them. The one on the right was actually drawn and then printed in India by Indian printers, and these albums are in the possession of the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh, as are the original drawings, and have been published by Henry Nolte in a number of magnificent volumes, trying to bring all these this production together. So, if then, to close, one re-examines the concept of the scientific revolution, especially in the 19th century, you see how this participation in the making of new knowledge of this period, especially the knowledge which we now consider to be our science, and how much of this is based on contributions and on significant contributions, knowledge contributions, not just information, but knowledge contributions by others, So I've just given you one example, but one could, with this one example, actually look and see and inquire as to what was happening elsewhere, and to try and dig out not only sources of information for Darwin and for others, but actual knowledge which was incorporated and which became part of the wider knowledges of the 19th century. And I would then plead of a scientific revolution, a real scientific revolution, but not one of the 17th and 18th, but one more of the 19th century. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Raj. It was a wonderful talk, and I loved that you link this idea of the scientific revolution with Darwin's own work and ideas. And I don't know if we have questions, Marco. Because Marco he might be receiving.
He says.
Wait for a few minutes because we have a delay of the bro. Okay.
Yeah, as I told you yesterday, that I couldn't have given the same talk in a different series.
Yes.
So
That's nice. Mientras Marco recibe las preguntas, si es que las hubiera, no, me gustaría comentarles que el profesor Rack, la primera vez que vino a México fue en el año 2019, estuvo aquí por un corto periodo y efectivamente una de las conferencias que dio era parte de lo que ahora hemos oído. Pero hemos tenido la suerte y el privilegio de haber contado con su presencia este año, pero durante 3 meses. Él impartió un curso tanto en el posgrado de Ciencias Biológicas como el de Filosofía de la Ciencia, y fue un curso que realmente tuvo bastante éxito, y nos dio mucho gusto tenerlo, nos dio nuevas perspectivas de cómo enseñar justamente la historia de las ciencias, y quedamos muy complacidos por su presencia. Él también quedó muy contento de haber venido a México, y esperamos que no sea la última vez que nos visita. Tenemos, Kapil, we have some questions. One question in the chat. Is there evidence that ancient civilizations developed microbiology or the use of radiation?
No, there's no evidence of any of this, because microbiology, what we call microbiology and what we call radiation, are things which are concepts that were created very recently, in fact, only in the 20th century. And it would be, in a way, completely anachronistic to transpose our categories of thought onto previous periods in history. People had, and as historians, we should respect the categories of a period and try and understand what people were trying to do and what were their frameworks, what were the questions that they were asking, and how were they trying to respond to them. So, I mean, both microbiology and radiation are questions that are categories that we use. They're very contemporary categories.
Thank you. Marco, do we have more questions?
No, we don't.
No, we don't? Entonces, le damos las gracias y despedimos al doctor Kapil Raj. Thank you very much, Professor Raj, for being with us today, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for being patient and listening to me.
No, on the contrary. On the contrary, the pleasure was ours.
Yeah, but I'll be seeing you all tomorrow.
Yes,